What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 232. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Bonus show today. I have a great lineup of shows planned this week. Of course, Connor Freeman, the co host, will be here with an episode, and the great Scott Horton will be returning. So, you definitely want to make sure you're subscribed to the show so you don't miss an episode. We post the video version at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. The audio's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and that means you can also subscribe on the Libertarian Alt podcast feed. Get this show, the Scott Horton Show, Liberty Weekly, which is hosted by frequent guests of the show, Patrick McFarlane, and a lot of other great content. So another great way to check out the show. Also at the Institute, you will find all the writing that I've been doing. Along with Will Porter, we've been authoring articles every day at the Institute. There's probably been like 7 in the past 10 days. So go over onto the Institute, check out what we've been writing. We're covering a few of those on today's show. And then donate if you can. Patreon, subscribe, start crypto, all that information in the show notes page. Another way to support the show is by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. That saves you 25% when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. And so it's a great way to do your CBD shopping at a company that has high quality products and also support this show at the same time. They have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. Basically, any way you could get your CBD gummies, soft gels, tinctures, those high dosage extracts, and then of course the topicals that I really like. I always recommend the sports cream to people, and also fantastic products even for your dog. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Help yourself out, help the show. All right, now let's get into the news on Russia first, where there has continues to be some diplomacy going on. Of course, if you're just more looking at the U.S. mainstream media and the narrative putting out very heightened rhetoric, a lot of it coming from the Biden administration, that Russian invasion could happen this week, and yet this really isn't what we see coming from particularly Europeans or Ukrainians, Russians, and then not really what you hear by the talks going on between European parties. So we'll start off with the Normandy format talks, which of course are important because in the past these talks produced the Minsk II agreement, which, while it hasn't completely ended the Ukrainian civil war, has largely prevented territory from changing hands and a somewhat restful ceasefire that does kill people, the fighting going on in eastern Ukraine, but certainly not to the extent that you see in places that have active war zones. And so these talks in the past have been important. However, currently it doesn't seem like they're going anywhere. Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com writes that they failed to make progress in the latest round of talks. These talks are focused on, I think, more what's happening in Ukraine, particularly the Donbass area, and not necessarily the same thing that the U.S. and Russia have been talking about some with the placement of U.S. missiles and things like that. So important to note there. Now, they did schedule another round of talks for March, and so that I think is a somewhat encouraging sign that the Germans and the French aren't so concerned that Russia's going to invade this week, that they're pressing for more and more of these talks. The fact that they feel like they have room till March maybe signals that the urgency that the U.S. is presenting isn't quite there. We further get that in the call between Putin and Macron. They talked on Saturday. This is the French president and the Russian leader, of course. And during that call, it lasted 90 minutes. I didn't see a lot of what happened on that call, but after the call, an official said that Macron, said, "We see no indication that President Putin, that he is going to go on the offensive." And that means that, they don't see an invasion likely. This backs up what Macron was saying before he traveled to Moscow to meet with Putin last week. And then, of course, he met with Ukraine's leader Zelensky in Kiev. Now, I guess maybe the one disappointment here is that there was maybe some hope. Putin has said that the talks with Marcon, that what he presented could be a potential basis for an agreement. And so, if that was focused on the Donbass region and de-escalating tensions in Ukraine, what Putin and Marcon were talking about last week, and then you do have these Normandy format talks that fail to produce anything, where you have both Russia and Ukraine, there with Germany and France. Maybe that is a bad sign on the angle that Marcon was trying to take. Now, Biden and Putin also spoke over the weekend for about 60 minutes. As far as I could tell, I'm not seeing a lot coming out of these talks. The U.S., continues to maintain their very hawkish position, and Russia, says they're not going to invade. The U.S. is saying that, the invasion could come at any time now, and you're starting to have a change in rhetoric in Ukraine on the Russia issue, where Zelensky is now identifying the source of panic as potentially being the biggest crisis point. So this is the latest piece that I have out at the Institute in the roundup section. Ukraine collects weapons while downplaying the Russian threat. And in here, me and Will write, weapons from U.S. allies are pouring into Ukraine: Stinger missiles from Lithuania, drones from Turkey, manpads from Poland, anti-tank missiles from the UK, artillery from Estonia, as Congress debates whether to send more lethal aid atop the $200 million already authorized. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky now finds himself in a predicament. While the appearance of a heightened Russian threat has allowed Kiev to arm itself on the cheap, there is no such thing as a free lunch, as he is finding out that being the target of war propaganda has a steep price with real consequences for the Ukrainian economy. At this point, Zelensky's top concern appears to have shifted from Putin to Biden, urging Ukrainians to remain calm, and the relentless predictions of a Russian invasion from Western leaders and press reports. Right now, the biggest enemy is a panic, he said during recent visit with troops stationed near the Russian border. And so, yeah, this is, what we're seeing from Ukraine, saying that, look, it's the Western rhetoric, the Western actions that are the biggest problem right now for Ukraine. Our biggest concern isn't a Russian invasion, but the panic created by that. We have Biden with increasing urgency telling Americans to get out of Ukraine. There is some debate going on, I saw in the American mainstream now, about what should Biden do if Russia invades Ukraine, and really pushing Biden to take a stance that he would deploy troops to defend Americans in Ukraine. Rightfully, I think Biden has stood against this and has more or less said that, no American troops will be in Ukraine if there is an invasion. The U.S. has taken steps to downscale its embassy presence. It has shifted some of its embassy operations to Poland. Of course, it has removed the families of the embassy staff from Ukraine. I think some more like non-essential personnel have been allowed to go, and now it is shifting a lot of its operations that were going on in Odessa or Kiev to other places in the country. I guess that would feel it would be easier to evacuate, faster to evacuate should Russia invade or something like that, right? Should they feel the need to evacuate. Now, Russia has also decided to change its embassy personnel in Ukraine, saying that they were optimizing their embassy staff and actually, I guess, relocating some services out of Ukraine. They say it's because the actions taken by Western governments made them very concerned that there is going to be a false flag or something like that. This isn't necessarily a lie from the Russian government, but of things that are concerning of a potential Russian invasion, it does seem that, relocating and emptying out some of their embassy staff may be some issue. And so that is something to be concerned about and looked into and just to pay attention to. Now, let's see. I want to mention here that the U.S. is moving the 160 members of the Florida National Guard that are in Ukraine, training the Ukrainian forces out of the country. And so, this is I don't know if it's a big deal or not, but that the U.S. is taking all these steps are very public, of course, demanding that people get out of the country, and then at the same time moving the embassy staff that a lot of people probably have to access to find a way out of the country is causing a increasing panic and alarm and just stress on the Ukrainian system, and so my guess is this is doing real damage to the Ukrainian economy, and there's a lot of concerning Ukraine about what's happening, not necessarily because of a potential Russian invasion, but because of the actions of the West. Now, it could be completely unfounded, and I think that is still the more likely thing, that Biden here is essentially Chicken Little, right? And he's just, the Russians are coming, and it's really not the case. I guess, the mainstream media is continuing to paint him as Paul Revere, though, being the one who's bravely calling out Putin's coming advance, while the Europeans and even the Ukrainians are attempting to downplay it. It is worth noting that Zelensky and the officials in Ukraine definitely have probably an incentive to downplay the appearance of instability is not good for a leader, and especially at the point where your near allies like the U.S. are retreating from your country. It probably does not look good, and so there's a lot going on here, and again, I'm not saying that there's going to be an invasion or anything like that, but there are a few places where you can look at and say, this news is rather concerning. The main thing to highlight is the US isn't going to do anything if Russia invades, and that is the most important thing here, and that is, while not great on the American part, because you are creating a situation where you're provocative towards Russia, NATO expansion, talking about admitting Ukraine into NATO. That's what Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, was doing in the fall, saying all the things about how we're committed to Ukraine's territorial integrity and everything like that, really suggested to Ukraine that the U.S. was with them on this issue. And, it's very clear now that we're not, and we're willing to talk about it and everything like that, but we're not actually willing to follow through and defend Ukraine. And if the U.S. isn't willing to defend Ukraine, then there's really nothing that's going to keep the Ukrainian government from succumbing to a Russian invasion. And it's really just a very terrible thing to do. Now, I'm glad that Biden is choosing to stay out, but the real thing the U.S. should be working on is diplomacy here, making it very clear to Russia and Ukraine that there's never going to be U.S. anti-missile systems in Ukraine, that there's never going to be an addition of Ukraine or Georgia into NATO, and taking those things off the table would likely be the key steps needed to preventing Russia from invading Ukraine, despite what you're going to hear in the mainstream media and from the Hots. And so just want to make all those points. The U.S. is deploying 3,000 troops to Poland. They say this is to help with any potential evacuation. So, a whole bunch of Americans are coming to the Polish border with Ukraine. They would help get those Americans to different places. I suppose that's possible. They're definitely not going to do anything to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, these 3,000 troops. And if anything, the U.S. deploying more assets to the region is going to have the opposite effect. Far more concerning than the 3,000 troops are the more military assets the U.S. is moving in the region. They're going to be moving 4 destroyers from the Atlantic Fleet into the Mediterranean Sea. That's the Donald Cook, the Mister, the Sullivans, and Gonzalez. And so a lot, these ships have oftentimes the Aegis anti-ballistic missile systems, which are just the Patriot missile systems in the water. And so, of course, they could fire the Tomahawk missiles, and I'm sure Russia seeing the U.S. move all these into the region is seen as an increasing threat. And so, again, it does still seem unlikely to me that there would be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, especially this coming week, as America is saying. However, just know that there are a lot of provocative things going on, and that option I don't think is absolutely impossible. That Putin has now made the calculation that the only way to prevent Kiev from being raising the NATO flag is to essentially take it over and either maybe like put in charge of puppet government or Russia friendly government in Ukraine, or just, and that's the whole thing. Not sure, how far Putin would go in all of that. And there are a lot of options there to look at. And I'll probably get into that more on the show with Scott, but, just want to mention that. Now, before we move on from this topic, I do want to say that Hungary is saying they don't want any more NATO troops in their country. And then this interesting story from Haaretz, Lapid, who is the Israeli foreign minister, says Ukraine asks Israel for assistance and then must do everything to prevent Russia fighting. Israel says that it's a unique country in that there's large Jewish populations in both Russia and Ukraine, and so they have a unique responsibility to prevent any fighting from going on, because as they see themselves as a Jewish state, that would be something that they would oppose. Now, he says the Ukrainians came asking for all kinds of weapons, but it seems that the Israelis turned them down and said that they are not looking to get further involved in this conflict. Also interesting that Lapid identified that it was the American officials that were largely driving the inflated rhetoric on this issue. And so I think that's all the news that I have on Ukraine. I just, want to lay it all out, talk about all the nuance and everything like that you're not going to get in the mainstream media, because a lot of it is just invasion. The Russians are coming. And I still think that it does seem on the unlikely side. Now, I want to talk about some news on Afghanistan, and the most important thing going on with Afghanistan is what Biden is doing to the Afghan government funds. This is maybe the most Trumpian thing that I have seen Biden do. He's taking the $7 billion that is in the Afghan government's central bank account and splitting it into two $3.5 billion funds, so stealing the money. $3.5 billion is going to go into a fund that's going to assist the 9/11 victims' families, and then $3.5 billion will go into a fund that is going to, I guess, potentially go to aid to U.S. approved projects in Afghanistan. Daniel Larison writes, the U.S. is committing a grave injustice against the Afghan people, and the money that will be diverted to an aid fund will do nothing to address the liquidity crisis that has led the country's economic implosion. Instead of releasing funds to Afghanistan's central bank and allowing some level of economic activity to resume, the administration has managed to find an indefensible way to release the funds. The Humanitarian Trust Fund is an attempt to set up a mechanism outside of Afghanistan's institutions to funnel aid into the country, but the aid is going to be a trickle compared to what the Afghan people need to survive and recover. And this, he quotes Emerson Brookings, commented earlier today, this is not just frozen assets, it's the entire reserve of the Afghan central bank. This act will destroy whatever remained of the formal Afghan economy. It will make Afghanistan entirely reliant on small rations of foreign aid. Larison continues, the decision to divide the money and keep half for the families of 9/11 victims is outrageous and difficult to see how the U.S. has any legal authority to use the funds in this way. The U.S. is simply taking the money because no one can stop it from doing so. The U.S. is supposed to be keeping that money in a trust on behalf of the Afghan government. There is no good reason why the money belongs to the people of Afghanistan should be handed over to the victims of a crime committed by non-Afghans decades ago. This is theft on a massive scale, and it is being done at a time when Afghanistan is desperately needs an infusion of the funds. The Biden administration may think that it is staving off criticism from Hawks by keeping the money for the victims' families, but it is cynically and morally bankrupt that it is rightly provoking a much bigger backlash than a simple unfreezing of access ever would have. And so this is the real issue here is that Biden made this decision for political reasons, not because it's what's best for the people of Afghanistan, not because it's just. He made this decision because it's politically easy and it doesn't give any funds to the Taliban, which the Hawks in Congress will cry about and complain about. But as far as the American people care, giving money to the Taliban isn't going to hurt us in any way. And unfreezing that money, and yeah, some of it is going to go to the Taliban, will allow the Afghan government to experience some level of economic normalcy and get some aid into that, not aid, goods and commerce into that country, and that will start to allow the people to survive and have an economy to depend on. They'll have the money to go buy food at the market and everything like that, which doesn't exist right now. And it's just absolutely terrible what the Biden administration is doing. Myself and Will wrote an article this week at the Institute on sanctions, titled "Sanctions Set America on the Path to War, Claiming Lives with No Benefit." And on the Afghan issue in particular, we talk about how, for months now, the international aid community has been warning that, look, we have to unfreeze these funds. The people of Afghanistan are desperate. And instead, the U.S. is gauging in economic warfare. And we have all kinds of senators backing this. Chris Murphy, who is supposed to be kind of a humanitarian, saying that there is, frankly, moral hazard in putting billions into Afghanistan right now. And so he's doesn't see a moral hazard in starving hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Afghan children to death this winter. That's not his top concern. His top concern is potentially the Taliban getting some of that money and then using that money to potentially oppress women or something like that. Of course, I guess if the Taliban have no money, then they can't oppress women. Of course, if you starve so many people to death, then they won't be alive to be oppressed either. Republican Senator Tanya Young echoed what Murphy said, saying the worst case scenario involved would be humanitarian aid were diverted from legitimate recipients towards the Taliban. So he's saying the worst thing that could happen is it possibly getting to the Taliban. Even Ron's awesome, Rand Paul said that the Taliban aren't a legitimately elected government, and in no way in the world would I give them that money. And so even Rand Paul says they're not a legitimately elected government, which means nothing, right? Like the fact that they control Kabul and control the whole country to Rand Paul apparently means nothing. The fact that they weren't elected, nonetheless, all the elections in Afghanistan, as Rand Paul knows, have been a sham forever. And so why that would be this standard is completely inexplainable from Rand Paul's standpoint, and very disappointing that he's echoing this hawkish rhetoric. Of course, it's all because they're just terrified anybody of ever looking weak. That's the biggest fear among the U.S. government, is looking weak, and that creates so many problems. And because of that, thousands and probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Afghans are going to starve to death. Is what we're looking at, is what the predictions are now. I think the World Food Program says that 14 million Afghans do not have food, do not have access to food. They, find some here and there, but skipping meals, things like that in order to eat, and that there are 8.7 million at the risk of starvation. 1 million Afghans have already fled the country, mostly into Pakistan and Iran. And then I think that's about all the news I have on the information inside of Afghanistan. I'll also note, as a part of Biden, freezing and redistributing the funds to different accounts, the funds for the former Afghan government's embassies, so their embassy in the U.S. and all these other countries that they have, all those accounts have now been frozen. And so you have people who are sitting in those embassies because they don't want the Taliban to get in, but now they no longer have access to funds. And so my guess is that this is going to be a real issue in the long term. Now, a couple other important things on Afghanistan. The first is that a lot of the refugees that were evacuated from Afghanistan still haven't made it to the U.S. or are being held in military bases in the U.S. There are, I think, 12.5 thousand people that fall into this category, and apparently the conditions are getting really bad there. As me and Will report in our article, there are people saying they're being denied medical care, and while they have enough food, they're essentially being held prisoners, and they have no idea when they're going to get to go anywhere else. They're just stuck, 10,000 people roughly in the UAE in relatively like okay conditions, but again, like not having like any way to like move forward with any big things you need in life. And when this has been going on since August, so we're talking 6 months here, again, not having the medical care you need and things like that really start to add up, and this is really significant. And again, protests have broken out because of it. The Pentagon and then a report from ProPublica have revealed new information about the Abbey Gate bombing at the Kabul airport that killed over 150 people. This is a suicide bomber going and detonating his vest. Of course, in the past on the show, I've discussed who this suicide bomber was, being arrested in India, being alleged to have involved in Al-Qaeda there, being put in a prison in Afghanistan, and then eventually during the fall of the U.S. built government in Afghanistan, he gets out, somehow gets connected with ISIS-K, goes by himself to the Abbey Gate and blows himself up. The U.S. report says that there was no other attacker or anybody else involved. That report did outline that there had been 4 other people killed by the U.S. government during the withdrawal up until that point. 2 members of the Taliban were shot and killed by the Americans. A member of the Afghan National Army that was somehow still involved in the thing. Maybe it was a green on blue type situation. There's not a whole lot of information on, but one was shot dead by American forces. Apparently, there's no concern about what happened in either of those cases. There was also a civilian killed, apparently by a soldier throwing a stun grenade into a crowd, and there is maybe some investigation that is going to happen with that. But on the actual suicide bombing itself, the American report came out and said that nobody was shot, that everybody died from the bomb or, from the consequences of drowning in the drainage ditch. And it was a ball bearing bomb. And so I think, not to like brag too much or anything, but our coverage on this show of that suicide bombing from August, from the very beginning, I guarantee you holds up better than anybody else's. We were on that was a ball-bearing bomb from the beginning, that people likely died in the sewage ditch, but we also said it was possible that people opened fire, and this seems to be confirmed in the ProPublica article, where they interviewed, I believe, 6 doctors in Kabul from 3 different places who say that they definitively saw gunshot victims, people who had been shot in the head and the neck. The U.S. says that the only gunshot fired were warning shots from the U.S. and U.K. forces. Now, it is worth noting, and I think probably important and could have even contributed to the number of people who died from sources other than the initial suicide bomber, that the UK and US warning shots were being fired from opposite sides of the Abbey Gate. And so this, maybe could have added to confusion in the number of people who died in that drainage ditch, the sewage ditch, drowned to death there. But at the same time, I do think this testimony from the doctors is important. If there are people who could tell the difference between a ball bearing, going through somebody and a bullet going through somebody, my guess is it's going to be doctors in Kabul. And so I tend to believe them over who the military says, especially since the military didn't interview anybody on the ground in Kabul. I did see that they, I think, said that even the Afghan commandos, the Afghan allies at the base, didn't fire on people. So I still have a lot of questions here. I hope the information comes out, but the Pentagon report doesn't seem to be definitive. And the last thing that I will mention before I wrap up the show today is that the new incoming potential head of CENTCOM says he wants more over-the-horizon capabilities in Afghanistan. And of course, these are, the drone strikes and potential surveillance that he's talking about increasing in Afghanistan, which of course will likely lead to more suffering of the Afghan people. So That's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody is enjoying the show. If you are, please share it. You find it at the Libertarian Institute. We often post, if it's an anti-war show, on the blog and antiwar.com. Then also YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, Facebook, Twitter. We post clips from every show. And check out the writing that me and Will have been doing. I'm really, really happy with the quality of the writing that we're putting out, the frequency of the writing that we're putting out, and I think it stands up pretty well and it's real informative. So head on over to the Institute and check it out. Be back with more shows later this week, including Connor Freeman and Scott Horton.